Robert Baratheon sat heavily on the iron throne, the dull light of the hall illuminating the cold metal swords beneath him. His broad shoulders, once the epitome of knightly strength, seemed weighed down by something far heavier than a crown. He gazed across the throne room at the lords and ladies gathered in tense anticipation. They wore their finest garments, but there was a hush to their presence, as if they too sensed that the king was about to speak words neither they nor their fathers could have foreseen. The hushed crowd included Eddard Stark, who stood with solemn dignity among the lords. Ned's gray eyes flicked from the king's face to the worn hammer resting against the throne's steps. Robert's old warhammer, symbol of the rebellion's might. Now it served as a silent reminder of the power that had toppled House Targaryen. Robert's face was ruddy with drink and emotion. The king never hid his moods, nor was he particularly skilled at crafting gentle words. He wanted honesty, straightforwardness, and results. By his side stood Queen Cersei, dressed in shimmering green, her expression as inscrutable as a cat's. She cast occasional glances toward the king's courtiers, especially the lords of the Reach and the Stormlands. Farther behind was the diminutive form of Tyrion Lannister, whose keen eyes observed everything. He seemed to suspect that something monumental was about to unfold, something that, for once, might not involve him. Behind the Lannisters, the King's Guard stood in rigid formation, white cloaks brushing marble floors, their faces set in stoic watchfulness. Robert cleared his throat. The sound echoed through the hall, bouncing off high ceilings and gilded pillars. When he spoke, his voice was low but forceful, a resonant bass that had once rallied the realm to his banner. "My lords," he said, "there's talk that King Robert Baratheon does nothing but drink and hunt. That my greatest joy is a boar at the tip of my spear, and my hardest duty is climbing out of my mistress's bed." A few hushed chuckles rose, but the king's expression hardened. "But know this, I have not forgotten the responsibilities of my crown, nor have I ceased to dream of greatness for this realm." He paused, letting the hush settle back over them like a blanket of fresh snow. A slight flicker of movement drew everyone's eyes to the man entering the throne room. Tall, lean, with a wildness in his bearing that set him apart from the southern lords. His thick cloak was made of furs, layered with animal skins crudely sewn together. If the courtiers had not recognized him on sight, they would have guessed him a wild man of the woods. But whispers had named him already Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. He bore no crown, wore no gold. He had the look of one who walked freely, carrying only the weight of his own convictions. Yet, for all his rough attire, Mance Rayder's eyes glittered with intelligence and discernment. He moved through the crowd as though he were not intimidated by the opulent walls or the iron seat of kings. There was a certain quiet in the room as men and women realized what it meant for a wildling leader to come so far south, unarmed under a banner of truce, to speak with King Robert Baratheon himself. When Mance Rayder reached the base of the throne, he bowed not deeply, but enough to show that he understood courtly customs. A moment later, he rose again, defiant in a calm, measured way. The king nodded. "This man," Robert declared, waving a heavy hand toward Mance, "has walked among the free folk. He leads them. We called them wildlings once, but now we must see them for what they are. Men and women, children, folk who live beyond the wall without the laws we know. They are a people, a realm of their own of sorts, and they have long lived as exiles from the rest of Westeros." A ripple of shock and discomfort spread among the lords. Some glanced at each other in confusion. Others stood like carved statues, waiting for the king to continue. Robert shifted on the throne, his voice gaining in volume. "I have spent many nights pondering the wars we have fought. Good men died so that I could sit here, a rightful king of these 7 kingdoms. For many of us, that was victory. Yet, beyond the wall, these wild folk remain outside our laws but also outside our help. We call them raiders and thieves. They raid our borders, yes, guilty of that. But perhaps we, too, have been guilty of ignoring the bigger question. My friends, winter is always coming, as the Starks say, and I begin to realize how exposed we are in the north. If we leave these wild people beyond the wall, Alone against the cold and the threats that gather, we risk more than just raids. There are secrets in that land, far older than the memory of men." He paused, letting his words settle as if they had a weight of their own. His gaze swept the hall, fell on Ned Stark, found Tyrion Lannister's curious face, lingered on the stoic presence of Barristan Selmy. Finally, he gestured to Mance Rayder again. "In my wisdom or folly, if you will, I have decided to meet with Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. And in him I have found not a savage barbarian but a man who leads tens of thousands, a man who dreams of a future where his people need not pillage and starve. We have spoken and we have reached an agreement. I intend to open the lands beyond the wall, bring them into the fold of the realm, extend our borders. We will settle them under my protection." The hall exploded in whispers, half-voiced objections, and exclamations of shock. The king's pronouncement was too big to contain. They had always considered the wall the end of the realm, an ancient barrier as old as anything. The idea that the king would reshape that border seemed almost unthinkable. Mance Rayder said nothing. He simply observed, letting the southern lord's panic wash over him like water. Robert's voice boomed above the tumult, demanding silence. "Enough," he growled. "I know what you are all thinking, but listen to me. We cannot continue to ignore the north. There is land there, acres upon acres that no one here claims, land that these folk inhabit. If we bring them under our protection, they will need to follow our laws. In return, we will offer them peace and a place in the kingdom, yes, the Eighth Kingdom if you will, or an extension of the north. We will provide farmland, trade routes, better shelter. And we shall guard them, as they guard us, against the terrors of the true north." Cersei's eyes narrowed, but she maintained a diplomatic posture. She had never expected her husband to harbor any grand ambition beyond a full belly and a flagon of wine. Yet here he stood, forging a radical plan that would forever alter the shape of the Seven Kingdoms. Some lords began to mutter objections about tradition, about the sanctity of the wall, about the savage ways of wildlings. Robert listened, lips pressed tight in annoyance, then thumped the arm of the throne with a meaty fist. "We will hear counsel, of course," he said, though it sounded more like a formality than an invitation. "But in this matter my will is firm. I have spoken with my good friend Eddard Stark, and the Warden of the North will oversee the transition. He will work with Mance Rayder's people, ensure the peace, settle any disputes." Ned blinked but inclined his head, stepping forward. "Your Grace, I have agreed to aid the realm, for the North is my duty." His voice was calm, measured, though the lines of worry stood out near his eyes. "I will do as you command, and help bring these free folk under your banner, if it can be done peacefully." He glanced at Mance Rayder. "I believe that a measure of trust and caution must go hand in hand." Robert grunted his approval. His gaze flicked across the assembled crowd one last time. "This is a new beginning," he declared, though there was weariness under the bravado. "Let it be known that King Robert Baratheon means to protect all within his realm, even those who once stood outside it." With that, he rose, signaling the end of the audience. The courtiers bowed, their faces torn between shock, suspicion, and a spark of anticipation. The king beyond the wall bowed once more, turned, and departed with a steady stride, leaving the lords of Westeros in the swirl of a plan that would reshape the entire continent. In the days that followed, rumor spread like wildfire. Soldiers and small folk alike whispered that King Robert planned to march beyond the wall, not to conquer, but to unify. In taverns from the Dornish marches to the Vale, men drank to the possibility of new land and new opportunities, while others cursed the idea of taming savage wilderness. The Night's Watch, already struggling with numbers and leadership, found itself at the center of a storm of confusion. Its ancient mandate was to guard the realms of men, to keep them safe from whatever lurked beyond. Now, those they had guarded against were to be made part of the realm. Some Black brothers thought it a betrayal of their oldest vows. Others saw it as a chance to repair the failing state of the Watch, to accept that times changed and the North must change with it. Jon Snow listened to these debates in Castle Black's yard, feeling the tension rise among his brothers. Samwell Tarly expressed relief at the idea of fewer raids, but PYP and Gren voiced their misgivings about the nature of the free folk, with old stories of wildling cruelty on their minds. Yet through it all, Jon found himself wondering about the wisdom in forging alliances, about bridging the gap that had so long separated them. A pact with the free folk might offer more than an end to raids. It might be the beginning of something larger, something that would protect all from the threat of the White Walkers, if ever they returned. Over the course of a few short weeks, ravens flew north and south, carrying letters from King's Landing to Winterfell, from Winterfell to Eastwatch by the Sea, from Castle Black to the settlements of wildlings under Mance Rayder's banner. The realm was alive with uncertainty, but also with the undeniable sense that history was being made. Eddard Stark took up the responsibility of bridging the old rifts, traveling with a retinue of loyal men toward Castle Black. At his side rode his wife Catelyn, who had chosen to accompany him despite her misgivings about venturing near the wall. Robb Stark was left as Castellan of Winterfell in their absence, a test of his growing maturity. Their carriage trudged through the snows and muddy roads that led to the Shadow Tower, the chosen meeting place for the next phase of negotiations. The wind whipped across the north, carrying flakes of snow and the howling of distant wolves. Meanwhile, King Robert prepared an expedition. He insisted on leading it himself, ignoring Cersei's cutting remarks about the dangers and ignoring the protests of advisors who thought a king should not risk his life on such a perilous journey. But Robert's mind was set. He was a man restless in his own success, bored with the intrigues of court, and suddenly energized by this wild new idea. Riding at his flank would be some of the realm's fiercest knights, along with men who had personal reasons for interest in the north. He sent out calls for volunteers to join the cause, to settle new lands beyond the wall, to stand at the king's side as the border was pushed further north. Among those who answered were second sons, poor knights, and opportunists dreaming of new fiefdoms. Tyrion Lannister, too, found himself drawn to the spectacle. Ever curious about the world and sensing that something remarkable was afoot, he volunteered to ride with the king, though he knew his father would not approve. He expected no welcome from the wildlings, but the notion of seeing what lay beyond the wall was too irresistible for his dwarfish sense of adventure. So he prepared a wagon of books, quills, and parchment, determined to chronicle this unprecedented endeavor. Mance Rayder returned north to his people, spreading word that the king of the Seven Kingdoms was ready to treat with them. The free folk were wary, for they had learned distrust through countless generations. Tormund Giantsbane laughed and boasted that no southern king would last a fortnight in the true north. Ygritte watched with skeptical eyes, her red hair catching the light of campfires as she asked Mance if they were about to become kneelers. Mance shook his head firmly. He believed that kneeling or not kneeling was less important than survival and freedom, and that this alliance might offer both. So he traveled from camp to camp, calling the clans together, persuading them that it was better to negotiate from a place of strength than to remain forever at the edge of the realm, unloved and unprotected. On a cold morning, with the wind howling past the towers of Castle Black, Eddard Stark stood on the ramparts with Lord Commander Jeor Mormont. The old bear frowned as Ned explained the king's plan. Mormont had accepted that something had to be done, though he remained cautious. His men were thinly spread as it was, and if large numbers of wildlings began moving through the wall under a royal decree, it would change the Watch's mission drastically. Still, Mormont recognized that the realm's strength came from unity, not division. And if Robert Baratheon was truly set on forging an alliance, perhaps the Watch had a place in guiding how best to settle the newcomers. Ned looked out over the expanse of white beyond the wall. "When we rode south for Robert's rebellion," he said softly, "I never imagined this. Sometimes I wonder if we are forging new victories or sowing new troubles." Mormont grunted. "A bit of both, I suspect. The Watch will try to adapt. We always have." Down below, the courtyard was filled with the clamor of men moving supplies. Large crates of food, grain, blacksmithing tools, and tents were being prepared for the journey beyond the wall. Horses stamped and snorted in the cold air, steaming breath rising from their nostrils. Among the workers, Black brothers mingled with Stark soldiers, each wearing the sigil of a direwolf on their surcoats. Amid them all, Jon Snow carried a roll of furs across the yard, pausing to glance up at the ramparts. He caught sight of his father, who nodded in acknowledgement. Jon returned the nod, a determined set to his mouth. He had always dreamed of doing something significant for the Watch for the North. This venture might be it. Within another fortnight, King Robert arrived at Castle Black, accompanied by a retinue of knights, Lannisters, Baratheons, and various others. The Black brothers were awed to see the king in their remote stronghold, though Robert wasted no time in feasting. He met with Jeor Mormont in the Old Solar, with Eddard Stark by his side, poring over rough maps of the region beyond the wall. Mance Rayder joined them, bearing his own memory of the terrain, the frozen shore, the haunted forest, and the small streams that cut through the wild. That night, an informal gathering convened in the main hall of Castle Black. Long tables were placed end to end, laden with thick stews, bread, and salt beef. King Robert guzzled ale from a large horn, while Mance Rayder sat across from him, sipping more cautiously. Tormund roared stories of slaying giants, and half the men present either believed him outright or considered him mad as a hatter. Tyrion Lannister listened from a comfortable spot near the fire, chuckling into his wine at the outlandish tales. Men whose grandfathers had fought the wildlings found themselves listening to those same wildlings talk about the hardships of the true North. Warmer than any hearth was the sharing of stories, and though suspicion lingered, the seeds of understanding were being planted. Ned Stark watched it all, mindful that this was only the beginning. Come morning, the massive gates of Castle Black groaned open as King Robert, his knights, Eddard Stark, and the Night's Watch marched through. Mance Rayder and his trusted followers led them in, deep into the wilderness. Jon Snow rode near the front, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He found himself scanning the horizon, recalling the rumored existence of White Walkers and the uneasy sense that something lay dormant in the frozen distance. For now, though, their greatest challenge was forging alliances among those wildling tribes that had not yet pledged to Mance Rayder. The king intended to show them that the Seven Kingdoms came offering a pact, not conquest. Through dense forests they traveled, the ground thick with snowdrifts, the trees creaking under the weight of ice. The path was not wide, and more than once the men had to stop to clear fallen branches. Robert cursed and grumbled, complaining about the cold, but there was a spark in his eyes, as if he had awakened from a long slumber in King's Landing. Here, far from the intrigues of the Red Keep, he felt like the warrior he once had been. He wore a thick cloak of bear fur, and occasionally he would roar with laughter when someone slipped on the icy ground. Ygritte led a scouting party ahead, ensuring no hostile tribes would ambush them. She was wary, for she did not trust so many southern knights, but her respect for Mance kept her from stirring up trouble. Tormund's booming laughter could be heard even at the back of the column. The north was silent otherwise, still, as though the land were holding its breath. When they set up camp at night, men gathered around fires, swapping tales with the free folk. Here and there, tensions flared. Some old grudges refused to die quickly, especially among those who had lost kin to wildling raids. But the king's presence demanded restraint, and Mance Rayder's authority kept his own people from rash acts. In a dark corner of the campsite, Eddard Stark conferred with Mance and Robert. They pored over maps, discussing how best to offer land and settlement options to the free folk. Perhaps some could farm near the gift, others could keep to their camps farther north but under the king's protection. Taxes and laws were a thorny subject. The free folk had never bent the knee, and many bristled at the idea. Mance insisted on freedom of movement, a principle dear to his people. Robert sought to impose some measure of fealty in exchange for protection. Ned tried to find the middle ground. The first major test came when they encountered a tribe that had never pledged to Mance Rayder and held a fierce reputation for violence. This tribe, called the Ice River Hunters, lived near a frozen waterway that gave them their name. They had built rough shelters from the bones of animals and the branches of twisted trees. Their chieftain, a grizzled woman with scars across her cheeks, stood before the king's party, flanked by warriors holding chipped axes. Robert did not balk, though the sight was unnerving. He stood as tall as he could, ignoring the chill wind that cut through his furs. "I come in peace," he declared, though his voice still carried the force of a battle commander. "I am Robert Baratheon, King of the Undulls and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. I would welcome you to join this realm, to share in its protection, its farmland, and its unity." He gestured to Mance. "Stand with your king beyond the wall, who now stands with me, and you will be rewarded." The Ice River Hunter's chieftain spat on the ground. She eyed Robert with barely veiled contempt. "Never needed southern kings, never will," she said harshly. Her accent was thick, her vowels elongated. "What do you give us but words?" Mance stepped forward, calm but firm. "I said you would be free to do as you wish, so long as you cause no trouble. The winter grows cruel, and it will grow. Crueler still. If we stand alone, we die alone. Join us, and you will have allies." She eyed him, then eyed the knights in their gleaming armor. For a moment, the tension coiled like a serpent ready to strike. At last, the chieftain gave a sharp nod, though she did not drop her axe. "I'll hear more of this alliance, but if I find it wanting, we go our own way." Robert exhaled. "A fair deal. That is all we ask. If you find it wanting, you remain free, provided you do not raid your neighbors under my protection." The uneasy meeting ended with a promise for future discussion, and the king's party continued on. Farther along, they encountered scattered bands of wildlings, each with their own traditions, each requiring delicate handling. Some recognized Mance Rayder as their leader, others did not. Despite the differences, a pattern emerged. The winter's threat loomed large, and the offer of safety and resources from the south was not easily dismissed. Over time, more agreed to meet further south, near the wall, to discuss formal terms. Between negotiations, the king's men hunted game, exploring the new territories. Tormund would join them, bellowing encouragement, while Tyrion complained about the cold but kept up, eager to see every new wonder. They discovered remote valleys where the snow was so deep that horses struggled to pass. They glimpsed half-frozen lakes surrounded by enormous pines. Night came early in the north, and the aurora sometimes shimmered across the sky, painting the heavens in ghostly lights of green and purple. In this hush of nature, Robert felt more alive than he had in years. At night, he would talk about forging new houses beyond the wall, awarding titles to those brave or foolish enough to settle. Ned thought it a dangerous prospect, cautioning that the wild was no place for stone keeps and southern lifestyles. Mance reminded them that the free folk did not live by lords and ladies, but by their own means. If a new realm were to be shaped, it would have to respect both ways of life, or it would collapse into bloodshed. Days stretched into weeks, and by the time they turned back toward Castle Black, they had visited numerous camps and tribal strongholds. The seeds of the alliance were planted, but many uncertainties remained. Would these tribes truly honor the king's laws once the immediate threat of winter was past? Would lords in the south ever accept wildlings as their equals? And what of the ancient evils that were rumored to stir in the far north? When the party finally returned to the wall, they found a gathering of free folk waiting there, led by Mance's most trusted captains. They had come to see for themselves if the Southern King was as honorable as Mance claimed. The Black brothers stood atop the ice ramparts, uncertain whether to feel overrun or relieved that the parley was happening in daylight and not as a raid. Robert, Ned, and Mance held a grand council in the shadow of the wall, with the men of the Night's Watch observing warily. Wildling chieftains and elders came to speak, some bearing tokens of their clans. A carved bone totem, an antler used as a staff, a necklace strung with teeth. The men of the Seven Kingdoms brought their banners, which flapped in the biting wind. Here, on a broad expanse near the wall, they hammered out the outlines of an agreement. The king beyond the wall and the king of the Seven Kingdoms would recognize each other's authority, with Mance acknowledging Robert as an overlord in a limited sense. Robert would not force the free folk to swear fealty in the traditional way, but they would cease all raids into the north and accept that land distribution, trade routes, and laws must be maintained by some form of governance. A new office, perhaps an extension of the Warden of the North, would administer the relationship, ensuring that no clan was left to starve, that no southern knights trampled on wildling traditions, and that no free folk would violate the safety of the realm's subjects. The council took days, each session punctuated by heated arguments. Tormund demanded that no fences or walls be erected to pen them in. A wildling elder insisted that they should be allowed to hunt in the forests without restriction. Robert countered that certain areas, particularly the gift and lands around it, were crucial for agriculture and must be protected. Ned tried to mediate, guiding them toward a compromise. Mance's leadership proved indispensable, for he commanded respect among the free folk even when they hated the notion of kneeling to a southern king. In between sessions, Tyrion recorded everything meticulously, scribbling notes on parchment. He sensed the gravity of what they were doing. Wars had been fought for less radical changes, and here, in the freezing shadow of the wall, men were trying to reshape centuries of animosity into something like peace. At last, they drew up a formal pact, to be sealed with the king's own signature and Mance Rayder's mark. It declared the region beyond the wall as part of the extended realm, but with certain freedoms unique to the free folk. It provided for the settlement of any southern subjects who wished to venture north, with the understanding they would respect wildling traditions or be subject to the king's justice. It established the Night's Watch as guardians of the passage, to ensure that only those who came peacefully would pass. And it established an open border for trade, with the caveat that the king's officials would oversee the distribution of resources. The final morning of the council was a solemn affair. Snow drifted lazily from the sky, and a hush fell upon the participants as the final parchment was presented. Robert took a quill, dipped it in ink that nearly froze in the cold air, and signed his name, Robert of the House Baratheon, first of his name. Then he handed the quill to Mance. The wildling leader hesitated. He was no lord, and the notion of signing documents went against the grain of free folk tradition. Yet he understood the power of symbol. With careful strokes, he scrawled his own name, an act that felt both binding and strangely liberating. A cheer rose from the assembled men. Some of the free folk remained stoic, uncertain how this alliance would truly protect them. But the deed was done. The realm now extended beyond the wall, at least in principle. Robert slapped Mance on the shoulder, nearly bowling the slimmer man over. "We'll drink to this," he roared, and the lords and knights joined in the cheer. The wildlings, still wary, muttered among themselves. Tormund, however, bellowed with laughter and demanded a barrel of mead be brought forth. And so, in the swirl of snow, men who had been sworn enemies a season ago now shared a moment of cautious hope. That evening, the king and Mance Rayder stood together at the top of the wall. The sun was setting in a blaze of red and orange, painting the snow below in vivid shades of fire. The cold wind howled around them, tugging at their furs. Robert looked out and saw the vast expanse of wilderness, the domain he had just welcomed into his kingdom. He leaned on the battlements, hefting the great warhammer he had brought with him as a symbol of his past. "I fought a war to take a throne," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd fight another to expand the realm without a single arrow loosed." Mance smiled wryly. "That's because this war was different. It was fought with words and trust, not steel. But battles are not won in a day, Robert Baratheon. We have to see if your lords and my people can keep this peace." Robert nodded. "Aye, that we do." He glanced at the swirling snow below. "But if winter grows worse, if what lies beyond stirs?" He let the unspoken fear hang in the air. Mance's eyes drifted to the north. "We'll need each other. I've seen things in the far north that would chill your blood. Let's hope unity can withstand them." They stood there, two kings, or perhaps one king and one leader, gazing at the new horizon they had forged. The land beyond the wall, once a realm unto itself, was now tied to the seven kingdoms, for better or worse. When dawn broke, Robert's expedition prepared to return south. He intended to stop at Winterfell, then eventually ride back to King's Landing, where the shockwaves of his decision would be felt. Mance Rayder would stay, continuing to spread the word among the free folk, ensuring they understood the terms of the new arrangement. The Night's Watch found itself adjusting to a far more diplomatic role than it had ever envisioned. Eddard Stark rode next to Robert as the royal party made its slow journey back through the gift. "Do you think the lords will accept it?" Ned asked, his face solemn under a light dusting of snow. "They'll damn well have to," Robert replied. "I'm their king, though I'll have to weather their moaning. The Tyrells, the Lannisters, the Martells, they'll all have their opinions, Ned. But let them come. I've made my decision, and I'll stand by it." Ned gave a faint smile. "Perhaps this is your greatest accomplishment yet, Robert." The king barked a laugh. "Accomplishment or folly? Time will tell." Word spread rapidly throughout the 7 kingdoms. From the Arbor to the Vale, from Sunspear to the Iron Islands, lords and small folk alike learned that the king had opened the lands beyond the wall to settlement, forging an unprecedented alliance with the wildlings. Many disapproved. Some hailed it as a bold stroke. Others feared it would bring chaos. The High Septon preached caution, uncertain how to interpret the presence of so many unbelievers within the realm. Merchant guilds in the major ports discussed the potential for new trade routes, with exotic furs and goods once out of reach. In King's Landing, the small council convened under the watchful eye of the Iron Throne. Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, had been ill, and the news from the north reached him in fragments. By the time Robert arrived with Ned Stark, the city was abuzz with speculation. Peter Baelish quietly maneuvered to see which new investments might prove lucrative. Varys listened to the whispers of how the realm's great houses would react. Cersei Lannister met Robert's eyes coolly when he returned. She had grown used to his absences, but this was different. The king had come back with a plan that would alter the entire continent. She masked her unease with courtly grace, complimenting the king on his boldness. Jaime Lannister stood by her side, looking more intrigued than hostile, while Tyrion watched from a distance, already well informed of events through his own letters. A royal audience was called, so that the king could formally announce the new expansions of the realm. The hall was filled with lords and ladies, ambassadors from Dorne, from the Vale, from the Westerlands. Robert, with Ned Stark at his side, declared that he had granted amnesty and a form of recognized freedom to the people once called wildlings. He spoke of farmland, trade, and the potential for new alliances. The members of the small council stood behind him in a show of unity, though some looked more enthusiastic than others. The response was immediate and varied. Lords from the Reach grumbled that they had no interest in so-called savage tribes. The Ironborn scoffed at the idea of taming a new frontier on land rather than sea. But some minor lords and knights saw opportunity. Having long been overshadowed by mightier houses, they now spied a chance to carve out a name for themselves in the newly opened north. Catelyn Stark, standing with Sansa and Arya in a place of honor, watched the spectacle in silence, her face carefully neutral. Over the next several moons, Robert's plan took shape. He commissioned a small fleet to ferry supplies to Eastwatch by the sea, assisting wildlings who wished to settle near the coast. At the same time, he offered incentives for any subject of the 7 kingdoms willing to venture north, promising tax breaks and grants of land. The king ordered that the roads leading to the wall be improved, so that the flow of goods would not falter. In Winterfell, Robb Stark took on greater responsibilities, acting on his father's behalf to ensure that the expansion did not harm the existing northern bannermen. The Umbers, Karstarks, and Manderleys were torn between suspicion of the wildlings and respect for their lord's new role. Some pledged to help keep the peace, while others braced for conflicts that might arise. Across the north, tensions simmered as the first wave of wildlings ventured south to trade. Scenes of hostility or grudging acceptance played out in market squares. A group of free folk, uncertain of southern currency, tried to barter with animal pelts. Most local merchants refused, demanding coins. Others recognized the quality of the furs and made fair trades, forging the beginnings of a new economy. Brawls broke out in taverns when old resentments surfaced, but some taverns found the novelty of wildling songs entertaining, drawing curious crowds. Meanwhile, the Night's Watch struggled to define its new role. Should they continue to guard the wall as if against an enemy, or facilitate a flow of people back and forth. Jeor Mormont insisted that they remain vigilant. As large as the new realm had become, ancient threats might still stir in the far north, so the Watch's vow to protect the kingdoms of men was as essential as ever. Yet, the Black Brothers found themselves checking wagons of supplies, escorting caravans, and mediating disputes between wildlings and southern settlers. Some found it a welcome change from the endless monotony. Others grumbled that this was not what they had taken the Black for. As the months passed, seeds of change took root. Clusters of new homes arose just beyond the wall, makeshift settlements where free folk and southerners tried to live side by side. Wooden palisades were erected for defense against the harsh elements and roving predators. The king's men trained volunteers to patrol these new communities, while wildling hunters taught southerners how to survive in a land where winter's bite was unforgiving. In King's Landing, the court was never without intrigue. Varys reported that certain factions, notably some of the higher lords in the Westerlands, quietly opposed the king's expansion, fearing it would drain resources from more profitable parts of the realm. Littlefinger, however, saw a potential to exploit new trade corridors which could be taxed. With his cunning, he managed to secure favorable positions in the bureaucratic apparatus for overseeing northern trade, lining his pockets in the process. In a dusty courtyard of the Red Keep, Arya Stark practiced her needlework of a different sort, taking lessons with Syrio Farrell. She found it difficult to concentrate on her footwork when her mind drifted to the stories from the north, tales of wildlings who rode giant elks, or the newly built huts of fresh settlers. Her sister Sansa, meanwhile, quietly embroidered a map of the realm that now extended beyond the wall, adding an eighth-pointed crown in a corner, symbolizing the free folk. At the small council table, Ned Stark felt the constant push and pull between the ideals of unification and the harsh realities of ruling. Robert seemed determined to continue forging alliances with Mance Rayder's people, but the king's interest waxed and waned with his mood. After the initial excitement, Robert sometimes appeared bored with the tedious details of governance. It fell to Ned, Jon Arryn, and others to ensure the plan did not unravel. Still, progress was made. The first official caravans of grain reached some of the wildling camps, preventing starvation in the harsh winter. In return, wildling hunters provided large quantities of fresh game, delivered to lords in the north and beyond. Over time, a tenuous web of interdependence was spun. Though mistrust lingered, the impetus of survival drove many to at least attempt cooperation. In the heart of winter, the snows grew heavier, winds sharper. Reports trickled in of scattered bands of ice creatures far to the north, sightings unconfirmed but ominous. Mance Rayder took these reports seriously. He sent out scouts, including experienced rangers like Rattleshirt, though the man was notoriously difficult, and others who had once been loyal to different chieftains. Their accounts were troubling. Though few could verify the existence of White Walkers, the feeling of unease was palpable. Strange tracks were found, the air tinged with an unnatural chill, and rumors of reanimated corpses started to spread again. Jeor Mormont received these rumors in Castle Black. He summoned Jon Snow, Samwell Tarly, and a contingent of the best rangers for a reconnaissance mission. Their goal was to venture further than before, verify these stories, and if there was any sign of the undead threat, to alert the realm at once. Jon felt a mixture of dread and determination. He had listened to Old Nan's stories since childhood, and the memories of that first encounter with a white still haunted him. Now, with the realm's new borders, the stakes were higher. A single incursion of the undead could unravel the fragile peace. The rangers departed at dawn, crossing the newly opened gates. They encountered pockets of wildlings who had chosen to remain in the far north, living in sturdy camps. Some greeted them warily, some with surprising warmth, now that the Black Brothers were not necessarily seen as enemies. Days stretched into nights, and the eerie silence of the far north descended upon them. Sam kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see a pair of icy blue eyes in the darkness. Jon gripped the hilt of Long Claw, its pommel shaped like a wolf's head, feeling the significance of the Valyrian steel. Should the White Walkers return in force, they would need every possible advantage. Meanwhile, back in King's Landing, the politics continued unabated. Cersei pressed her brother Tyrion for details about his time with the king beyond the wall, wanting to learn of any weaknesses she might exploit. Tyrion responded with wry half-truths. He found the entire situation fascinating, a testament to the realm's capacity to change if given the right push. But he also recognized how fragile it all was. A single catastrophic event could send the lords of Westeros into panic, dissolve alliances, and plunge the realm back into war. Highgarden watched the developments carefully. Mace Tyrell was not pleased that Robert had chosen the north for expansion rather than focusing on the more fertile southern lands. But with Renly Baratheon courting Margaery Tyrell, the alliance between House Baratheon and House Tyrell remained cordial. Even so, the Tyrell bannermen murmured that nothing good could come from meddling with wildlings. Likewise, the Martells in Dorne showed little enthusiasm for the king's new frontier. Prince Doran remained aloof, waiting to see how events might be used to Dorne's advantage. The Iron Islands, under Balon Greyjoy, expressed open contempt for the idea, though the king's navy remained strong enough to dissuade any immediate rebellion. In the Riverlands, the Tullus sought to keep the peace, while in the Vale, Lady Lisa Arryn sequestered herself and her young son in the Eyrie, ignoring much of the world's affairs. The Lannisters of Casterly Rock maintained their own council. Tywin Lannister had not spoken openly against the plan, but he had not committed any resources to it either. The realm teetered on the edge of acceptance, uncertain whether it should fully embrace or reject this transformation. Winter's cold pressed harder. Eddard Stark traveled north again, leaving the Hand's seat in King's Landing under the watch of Jon. Arryn, whose health had begun to fail. Ned's return to Winterfell was bittersweet. He greeted his family warmly. Catelyn, Robb, Bran, who was growing taller, and Rickon, still a toddler full of questions. But he could sense the undercurrent of tension as more and more wildlings ventured closer to Winterfell, some seeking shelter, others drawn by rumors of southern wealth. The North had always been a land of stark realities, where survival mattered more than prestige. Perhaps that made them better suited to accept the free folk. Yet old feuds died hard, and reports of theft and violence trickled into Winterfell's hall. Ned sent out men to keep the peace, punishing both sides fairly when disputes arose. Slowly, grudgingly, a form of coexistence took shape. Elsewhere, new southern settlers arrived at Eastwatch by the Sea, shipping goods and tools, establishing small enclaves that might someday become towns. They marveled at the frigid climate, the long nights, the moaning winds that carried the distant howls of direwolves. Many left within a fortnight, deciding that no tax break was worth freezing to death. Those who remained did so out of determination or desperation, forging alliances with free folk who knew how to hunt and survive in the unyielding cold. Some of these settlers found mentors among the wildlings, learning to fish in the icy waters or carve shelter from snowdrifts. Over shared fires and shared hardships, prejudices began to melt like ice in the spring sun. Back in Castle Black, Jeor Mormont awaited word from Jon Snow's reconnaissance mission. Ravens brought only sparse news, signs of strange footprints, rumors of wights, sightings of pale figures at night. The cold menace of the others remained intangible yet ever-present. Mormont grimly prepared for the worst, ensuring that the Black brothers were armed with dragonglass daggers and watchers were set around the clock. Jon Snow and his party pressed deeper into the wilderness, guided by ghostly starlight. The nights were unnaturally quiet, the snow crunching underfoot the only sound. When at last they found tangible evidence, an abandoned wildling camp, torn apart, with footprints in the snow leading nowhere. Jon felt a chill deeper than any winter wind. Sam trembled, refusing to leave Jon's side. The Rangers lit torches, scanning the darkness. But they found no wights, no White Walkers, only the echo of something gone. They returned to Castle Black with heavy hearts, uncertain what their findings meant. Perhaps the enemy was moving farther north, or perhaps it was preparing an assault. Mormont dispatched urgent ravens to King's Landing, Winterfell, and beyond, urging vigilance. The realm had changed, forging new alliances beyond the wall, but the ancient enemy did not care about treaties or expansions. If the White Walkers came, they would come for all. In King's Landing, the message from the Lord Commander caused a stir among the small council. Grand Maester Pycelle dismissed it as superstitious nonsense. Renly Baratheon seemed more intrigued by the idea of mythical creatures than truly alarmed. But Ned Stark's letter from Winterfell echoed Mormont's concerns. If the others were real, and if they stirred, the entire realm needed to be prepared. Robert scowled, remembering the old stories. He was not a man easily frightened, but the unknown weighed on him. Even so, the realm's expansion beyond the wall continued. The king insisted that the best defense was a united front, that thousands of free folk would bolster the realm's strength if the old legends proved true. Yet, practical measures were also considered. With the guidance of master-at-arms experts, new armaments were forged, including more dragonglass weapons, rumored to be effective against the others. Mining operations began near Dragonstone and in certain volcanic areas of the Vale, though yields of obsidian were limited. Farther north, Mance Rayder continued to gather the clans, urging them to adhere to the Pact. Occasional skirmishes broke out between the more stubborn tribes and the southern newcomers, but each time, Mance or Ned Stark intervened, asserting that unity was the only way to stand against the coming winter. Tormund Giantsbane began leading hunting parties that included both free folk and men from Winterfell, forging camaraderie over the shared excitement of the chase. Ygritte ventured south, trading knowledge of the wild for glimpses of southern life, always returning with stories of how these kneelers lived. Time marched on. The king's plan, while far from perfect, laid new foundations. A few hardy towns sprouted just beyond the wall, protected by the combined efforts of the Watch and volunteer militias. Wildlings roamed farther south to trade, but always returned to the wide open spaces they loved. The north found itself transformed into a mosaic of old and new, with the watchful eyes of House Stark striving to preserve balance. Still, the old hatreds did not vanish overnight. Some northern bannermen grumbled about having to deal with savage neighbors. Some wildlings chafed at southern laws they neither understood nor respected. Raiders still existed, though their numbers had diminished, and the king's justice was swift when they were caught. Tensions flared in small pockets, but the broader alliance held, tethered by the threat of winter's wrath and the guiding principle that survival was easier together than apart. In the Red Keep, Robert Baratheon grew older and heavier, yet in his eyes, there remained a flicker of the passion that had driven him to make this alliance. At court feasts, he would occasionally stand and regale the guests with tales of his journey beyond the wall, of the harsh beauty and the fierce, free people he had met. Cersei would roll her eyes behind her goblet of wine, while courtiers politely applauded. But the memory seemed to fill Robert with a sense of purpose absent in his earlier years. Instead of just roaring for more ale, he would speak of sending caravans north, or forging new roads, or ensuring the watch was well-staffed. He had changed, if only slightly. Over time, new visitors arrived in King's Landing, wildling representatives curious about the southern seat of power. They marveled at the heat, the noise, the markets overflowing with exotic goods. Though they often hated the confinement of city walls, some found it thrilling to explore the labyrinthine streets, tasting strange foods, seeing golden lions on Lannister banners and the crowned stag of Baratheon. The city guard watched these newcomers with suspicion, but few incidents occurred, for these were men and women chosen by Mance Rayder, more diplomatic than most. Tyrion Lannister, for his part, continued to act as a liaison, fascinated by the cultural exchange. He taught some of the visitors basic reading and writing, while they shared with him old myths of the North, stories of the children of the forest, and glimpses into the raw spirituality that bound them to the land. He made certain that these stories were recorded, preserving them for posterity. As the greatest test of the alliance approached, a winter said to be the hardest in memory, an uneasy peace held. Shipments of grain from the Reach arrived at White Harbor, then journeyed northward to feed both new settlers and long-established clans. Robert authorized further shipments, though the crown's coffers began to strain. Merchants made tidy profits, but the logistical challenges were immense. Roads had to be kept clear, especially near Moat Cailin and along the King's Road. Ned Stark oversaw the distribution of resources, ensuring that his own bannermen would not starve while also providing for the free folk. He walked a tightrope between fulfilling Robert's vision and preserving the loyalty of the North. His children grew older in a realm that was fundamentally different from the one Ned had known in his youth. Bran listened eagerly to wildling tales, while Arya yearned to sneak beyond the wall and see it all for herself. Sansa, more cautious, worried about the potential dangers. And still, rumors of White Walkers persisted. The Watchers in the far north continued to report odd happenings. Animals found frozen, as if by some unnatural cold, footprints that led into wilderness but never returned, glimpses of pale figures that vanished with the dawn. Mance Rayder and his people kept moving, scouting, always watchful. The uneasy consensus among them was that something ancient stirred, waiting for the heart of winter to descend. Under that gathering shadow, Robert's pact with Mance Rayder might well prove the difference between a realm that stood together against the cold darkness or one that fell divided into chaos. In the hidden corners of the land, old forces took note of these alliances. The children of the forest, if any still survived, would have seen men bridging the gap that once divided them. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. Deep into winter, the days shortened. The snows piled high around Winterfell, reaching the bottom of the castle walls. Ned Stark, looking out from the battlements, watched the swirling white landscape. Somewhere beyond that veil of snow, free folk huddled in their camps. Newly settled Southerners tried to carve out a life, and the Night's Watch stood vigil for threats older than memory. This was the shape of the world now. In King's Landing, torches blazed in the hallways of the Red Keep to stave off the damp chill that crept in from the Blackwater Bay. Robert nursed a cup of mulled wine, standing before a map of Westeros pinned to the wall. He traced a path north with one thick finger, past Moat Cailin, past Winterfell, up to the wall, then beyond. A faint, confident grin tugged at his lips. "We've done something great," he muttered half to himself. "If it holds, by the gods, I might just be remembered for more than that damned rebellion." A letter sat nearby, sealed with House Stark's direwolf sigil. It contained updates on the settlement progress, new trade routes, and a warning about the rising fear of the others. Robert drained his wine, thinking of the future. If the others truly walked again, it would be the greatest test of men. Yet, if the realm was truly unified, perhaps they might stand a chance. Somewhere far to the north of the wall, in a valley choked with ice, an old man, once of the Night's Watch, wandered in tattered black rags, half blind but still aware of the creeping cold. Another presence lingered there, silent and malevolent. Far beyond the knowledge of even the wisest maesters, the White Walkers stirred in the heart of the frost. Their glowing blue eyes turned southward, to a realm that had dared to expand its borders. The storm of ice and death gathered strength, awaiting the moment to descend. Thus, the newly shaped realm braced itself for an epoch of trial. Some men toasted to the king's wisdom in forging the pact. Others muttered that such radical change was doomed. But as the nights grew longer, one fact stood clear. For the first time in centuries, the people of Westeros, from the mild southern seas to the frozen northern wastes, were bound by shared cause. Whether or not it was enough would be decided by the unforgiving winter winds and the ancient powers that rode them. So the tapestry of the realm changed, woven with new threads of free folk and southern knights, fueled by hope and overshadowed by the encroaching darkness. Yet in that tapestry, a spark of unity glowed, a fragile flame in the snow. If the White Walkers came, they would find not a kingdom divided, but a realm determined, however imperfectly, to stand as one. Whether that determination would hold against the primal cold was a question that would define the next chapter of the realm's story. But in forging this pact, Robert Baratheon and Mance Rayder had given men a fighting chance against the long night ahead. Winter deepened its hold on the vast lands of Westeros. Snow and ice spread across the north, creeping further south than any living man had witnessed in decades. The shorter days and lengthening nights weighed heavily on the people, as though the world itself were drawing in its breath, preparing for an inevitable reckoning. Everywhere one looked, from the Frostfangs to the shores of the Sunset Sea, signs of the brutal season manifested. Rivers partially frozen, farmland lying fallow under thick drifts, and travelers moving in slow, careful processions, as if the land itself had become an enemy to all. In this relentless cold, the consequences of King Robert Baratheon's pact with Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, continued to ripple across the realm. Lords in the warmer south wondered why they should invest in lands so inhospitable, while in the north itself, the integration of free folk into the broader kingdom unfolded unevenly. Those who found the king's new measures disagreeable clung to old hatreds and prejudices. Those who saw opportunity or believed in solidarity labored to sustain settlements on the frontier. And all the while, above the howling wind, there loomed the faint fear of something even more dangerous than the cold. The others, whispered of in hushed voices, rumored to stir in the frozen wastes. In the courtyard of Winterfell, the heart of the north, a new bustle of activity had taken root despite the ever-present chill. Crates of supplies were being readied for shipment north, an unending procession of wagons destined for Castle Black, Eastwatch by the Sea, and some of the fledgling settlements that dotted the landscape newly opened by King Robert's decree. Northern soldiers, bearing Stark sigils on their cloaks, rubbed their gloved hands together, trying to keep warm while they loaded salted fish, dried fruits, grains, and warm furs. Mixed in among them were free folk volunteers, men and women who had ventured south to see the castle of the Stark family. They wore patchwork fur cloaks and leather boots fashioned after their own traditions, comfortable in the cold, but still taken aback by Winterfell's storied walls. Ned Stark supervised it all, calm but focused. Despite the many tasks demanded by his role as Warden of the North and now official overseer of the new settlement efforts beyond the wall, he tried to remain accessible to both the Northern bannermen and the wildling representatives. Passing by a wagon with a cluster of free folk laborers, he offered a polite nod. One of them, an older man with a lined face and a knotted walking staff, returned the gesture with a respectful dip of his head, clearly still unused to showing deference. But Ned's presence did not reek of southern arrogance, and that seemed to put the man at ease. Catelyn Stark stood not far from her husband, wrapped in layers of wool and fur. She wore a soft expression as she watched their youngest son, Rickon, chasing after a direwolf pup that had grown large enough to bound through the snowdrifts in powerful leaps. Bran, now on his feet and walking with an awkward gait after his accident, thanks in part to the care of Maester Luwin and the forging of special braces, observed them with a mixture of longing and acceptance. He was no longer the child who climbed towers for sport. His fall had changed him forever. But in these cold days, he found a strange solace in seeing Winterfell so full of life. It was as if the castle itself stood in defiance of winter's cruelty. Catelyn approached Ned, her breath forming delicate clouds in the frigid air. "The wagons are nearly ready," she said. "Maester Luwin suggested we increase the allotment of healing herbs and medicines. The free folk say that diseases spread quickly in cramped camps during the cold." Ned nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, have him pack as many as we can spare. If we run short, we'll send ravens to the Reach for more. The maesters in Old Town might be able to provide additional remedies. The cost will be heavy," Catelyn noted, "and some of our own stores will be depleted if we send so much north." A flicker of worry creased Ned's brow. "We'll find a way, if what Jon Snow reported is true. These are the nights that the free folk have long feared. We can't fail them, not after we've opened our borders and declared them part of the realm. If we let them starve or freeze, the alliance will collapse, and fear might do the rest." Catelyn glanced around, observing how men from distant clans interacted haltingly with northerners loyal to House Stark. "Fear is already here, my lord, but I know you'll handle it." She turned as the door to the great keep opened and a swirl of cold air swept inside. Arya darted out, wearing heavy boots and a thick cloak. Her dark hair whipped about her face. She spotted her parents and waved excitedly, then bounded over to them, brimming with the restless energy only Arya possessed. "Can I go with the wagons?" she asked. "I want to see the wall again." Catelyn's voice was firm but gentle. "You're far too young to travel with so few guards. The roads may be somewhat safe these days, but bandits are still around, and the cold is not kind." Arya scowled. "I'm not afraid of bandits or the cold. I know how to use needle." She patted the small blade at her side, a sword not much bigger than a knife but dear to her heart. "I'm not a little girl." Ned placed a hand on Arya's shoulder. "I know, my fierce wolf, but your training can continue here, and we need you safe within these walls. The next time we travel to Castle Black, I promise to consider bringing you, if circumstances allow." She regarded him skeptically, then gave a curt nod. "All right, I suppose I'll practice with Syrio in the meantime." "Do that," Ned said, a faint smile touching his lips. Syrio Farrell was still in Winterfell at Ned's insistence, continuing Arya's lessons until the family returned to King's Landing. That arrangement had felt strange at first. Syrio was a city creature, not used to the cold and wide expanses of the north, but he had adapted, and Arya flourished under his tutelage. As Arya ran off toward the training yard, Catelyn sighed. "She is growing wilder by the day." "She has a fire in her," Ned replied. "These times are uncertain, and she knows it. Let her have her lessons. There may come a time when she'll need them more than we would like." His words lingered ominously in the freezing air. Far to the west, on the King's Road heading north, King Robert Baratheon led a smaller retinue than on his previous journey to the Wall. He rode at the head of a column of soldiers from the Crownlands, accompanied by a handful of close knights and a few southern lords curious about the new frontiers. The king wore thick furs, but even so, the cold reddened his cheeks, and his breath came out in great plumes. He cursed at the dropping temperatures frequently, sometimes with a half-laugh, as though marveling at the severity of a winter he had not truly experienced since his rebellion days. At his side rode Ser Barristan Selmy, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Farther back, the other knights of the Kingsguard accompanied the king's wagon, which carried supplies and personal comforts. Ser Jaime Lannister was not among them this time, as Robert had grown tired of Cersei's arguments about sending her brother so far north. Instead, Jaime had been dispatched on a mission to the Westerlands, supposedly to quell banditry, though many suspected he wanted to avoid the bitter cold. Renly Baratheon had decided to remain in King's Landing, continuing his role on the small council. Littlefinger, for his part, had politely declined to follow the king north again, citing urgent financial matters, though Robert suspected Peter Baelish simply had no interest in freezing. Varys had remained as well, ever the spider in the capital's webs. Oenel. Why Grand Maester Pycelle had sent a junior maester along, more out of duty than enthusiasm. Among those who had chosen to ride with the king was Bronn, the sellsword who had begun to make something of a name for himself. He'd spent time in the north previously, aiding Tyrion Lannister. The king had found him capable in a scrap, and Bronn's direct manner amused Robert when the mood was right. There was also a minor lord from the Stormlands, Lord Cresswell, an ambitious man who smelled opportunity in the new lands beyond the Wall. He was a second son who had inherited his title only after his older brother perished in a skirmish years past, and he had a restless air about him, as though seeking to prove himself worthy of the seat he now occupied. Robert urged his horse onward, surmounting a small rise in the King's Road. He glanced back at the train of riders, knights, and wagons. Snow swirled around them, turning the world a monotone grayish white. The king's breath steamed in the cold. "We'll make the last hearth in good time," he rumbled, half to himself and half to Barristan. "The Umbers know how to throw a feast, by the gods. I'll warm my bones with their ale before we head to the Wall." Barristan smiled politely. "The hospitality of the North is known far and wide, Your Grace." "Yes, but so is their stiff-necked sense of honor," Robert said, his tone carrying a mixture of fondness and exasperation. "Still, a hot meal and a roaring fire will do us wonders. I've grown tired of this endless road, all ice and no comfort. Ned should be waiting for us at Castle Black, or so his last raven suggested. We'll see how well our new realm beyond the Wall fares." He did not say it aloud, but in his mind, Robert held a kernel of pride in having orchestrated something truly monumental. The original impetus behind the plan had been his restlessness and the looming fear of winter, yes, but there was now also a defiant streak in him that wanted to see the naysayers proven wrong. He had come to realize that forging alliances might in some ways be more satisfying than the wars of his youth. As the king gazed around, the stark whiteness of the north felt like a new page in the chronicle of his reign, blank and ready to be written upon. When they reached the last hearth the next day, the cold was so intense that even the horses' eyelashes froze. Great John Umber, lord of this fortress, welcomed them with boisterous laughter and hearty backslaps. Inside the hall, fires roared in massive hearths. Thick cuts of roast meat were served, along with mead strong enough to leave a pleasant burn in the throat. Robert indulged greedily, praising the Umbers for their unpretentious generosity. The great John roared toasts to the king, to House Stark, and even to the wild folk, though that last toast was met with a few uncertain looks. Times were changing, and even the rowdy Umbers had trouble fully embracing the new order. The next morning, after a restless night of feasting, the king's party continued north. Eventually, they crested another rise and saw the immense wall towering in the distance, stretching from horizon to horizon. Even in the swirling snow, it was unmistakable. A barrier of ancient ice, older than any living memory, shimmering faintly like a frozen jewel. The king felt an odd twist in his gut. He recalled his first journey here, when he had met with Jeor Mormont and the Black Brothers. Now, he returned under a very different banner, a banner of unification and expansion rather than simple inspection. Castle Black was alive with activity when the king arrived. Ravens fluttered above, carrying messages to and from the outposts that dotted the top of the wall. The courtyard teemed with Black Brothers, free folk, and northern soldiers mingling in a motley assembly. Makeshift stalls offered fur repairs, weapons, and hot broth. The combination of new settlers, the king's men, and the watch had created something almost like a bustling township at the foot of the ancient fortress. Wooden shacks and tents had sprung up around the castle's perimeter, forming the seed of what some were calling New Frostfield, though the name had not yet stuck with everyone. Eddard Stark and Benjen Stark, the latter returned from a short-ranging, greeted the king at the gate. Ned bowed with measured respect, and Robert dismounted heavily, a swirl of snow trailing behind him as he landed. He peered around, noticing the changes since his last visit. "Gods, Ned, you've gone and built a damned village here," he said, a hint of awe creeping into his normally boisterous tone. Ned's eyes flicked to the newly erected structures. "It's the result of the Pact, Your Grace. The free folk need somewhere to trade and gather before moving on. The Black Brothers do their best to maintain order. It's still rough, but for now it works." Robert wiped his brow, which was covered in frost. "Rough indeed. Well, let's see how these folk fare in a winter like this." He cast a sidelong glance at Benjen. "Still wearing black, I see." Benjen smiled thinly. "Still sworn to the Night's Watch, Your Grace, though our duties have changed somewhat since you opened the realm to the wildlings. We all adapt, it seems." The king nodded and signaled for his retinue to find stabling for the horses. Then he followed Ned into Castle Black's main hall, where a fire crackled in a large stone hearth. Jeor Mormont waited there, dressed in thick black furs, looking more like a grizzly bear than ever. The Lord Commander gave a curt bow. "Your Grace, we've prepared quarters for you and your men. We'll hold a feast tonight to welcome you, though I must warn you that our stores are not what they used to be." Robert waved off the concern. "Don't fret about fancy feasts, Mormont. Some hot stew and strong ale is enough for me. Besides, I haven't come to be pampered. I want to see how things stand." He glanced around, his gaze settling on a few Black Brothers who shuffled awkwardly under his scrutiny. "I trust the watch is still carrying out its main duty?" Jeor's expression grew grim. "Aye, that we are, though times are difficult. Many of our men have taken on roles more akin to peacekeepers among the new settlements. We remain vigilant for signs of trouble, be it from the free folk who refuse the pact or from that which lies beyond the Frostfangs." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "We've had a few worrisome sightings reported by rangers returning from deep beyond the wall. They speak of abandoned camps and tracks in the snow that vanish without explanation." The king's face darkened. He glanced at Ned, who maintained a calm but wary expression. Ned's told me as much in his letters. Are we any closer to confirming if these are the others? We've no proof, Gior replied bluntly. No white corpses to bring back, no living witness to an actual attack. Just the sense of something prowling. We can't say for certain, but the signs are enough to keep me awake at night. I've posted extra sentries. We've armed men with dragonglass daggers, though there's a shortage. Robert grunted. We'll need to organize more obsidian shipments from Dragonstone. If anything creeps from the night, we'll be ready. Meanwhile, keep your men on watch. I want to hear any new developments immediately. Gior inclined his head. Of course, Your Grace. They spoke at length about supplies, watch manpower, and the distribution of resources to the new settlers. Mance Rayder had set up an informal council of free folk chieftains, and they met periodically with Night's Watch officers to resolve disputes. Gior explained that it was a constant struggle to maintain harmony, with tensions flaring over hunting grounds and the notion of southern laws. Yet, surprisingly, many in the Watch found the arrangement preferable to the old days of endless raids and skirmishes. At least now there was a mechanism to address grievances before swords were drawn. As the afternoon waned, King Robert requested a tour of the new outpost forming around the castle. Ned accompanied him, along with a small honor guard. They trudged through packed snow, stepping around puddles that had frozen in the day's waning light. The outpost was a ramshackle assortment of structures. Many little more than wooden frames hung with animal skins to block the wind. Smoke rose from small fires where free folk gathered, huddled over cooking pots. Occasionally a black brother in a heavy cloak would pass by, nodding in acknowledgement. Here and there, the king and Ned saw evidence of the friction that Mormont had spoken of. A pair of men arguing about the price of furs, a woman cursing at a member of the Night's Watch for confiscating a stolen weapon, a group of wildling children running through the snow, shrieking with laughter as they tossed ice at each other. Yet, despite the rough edges and the obvious poverty, there was also a sense of possibility. People who had once been mortal enemies now shared a space, forging new relationships out of necessity. Robert paused in front of a stall where a grizzled wildling with a missing ear sold carved bone trinkets. The crafts were simple but oddly beautiful, pendants shaped like wolves or mammoths, and small figures that might have represented some forgotten gods of the north. The king picked up a pendant shaped like a raven, studying its details. "Good work," Robert remarked. "You carve all these yourself?" The man eyed the king with wary suspicion. Perhaps he was unused to southern lords complimenting his work. "I," he said curtly, "lost me ear in a fight with a direwolf years back. Took to carving while I was healing." Robert nodded. "Might buy one for Joffrey," he said, though he sounded uncertain. "He's not much for northern trinkets, but it might remind him that there's more to Westeros than King's Landing." The king pulled out a few coins. The wildling frowned at them, then grudgingly accepted, perhaps recalling that these bits of metal could be exchanged for more tangible supplies. Ned watched this exchange with mild surprise. Robert's attitude had softened since the early days of drunken hunts and idle feasts. The king might still be a rough, impulsive man, but he was at least trying to show interest in the new frontier he had helped create. Ned hoped it wasn't just a passing whim. They pressed on and came upon a small gathering near the edge of the settlement. There, in a makeshift square, stood Mance Rayder himself, the man who had once been a deserter from the Night's Watch and had risen to unite most of the free folk. He wore a cloak made of various pelts, stitched in a mosaic of fur. His posture exuded quiet confidence, and he was speaking with a group of wildlings who seemed upset about something. When Mance noticed the king and Ned approaching, he murmured a final word to the group, then stepped forward to greet them. "Your Grace," he said calmly, inclining his head. It was not quite a bow, yet it was not disrespectful either. "Welcome back to the true north." Robert studied Mance for a moment. "Rayder, got your letter about the troubles with some of the clans near Hardhome. The ones who refused the pact." Mance nodded. "Aye, a few smaller factions remain stubborn. They've seen Southerners as enemies for generations. Some of them blame the Watch for past raids, or blame the Starks for not recognizing our freedom sooner. We've tried to persuade them to accept the Pact, but so far, they've refused. They've holed up near Hardhome, living off what they can scavenge. Some were caught raiding passing caravans. Robert scowled. We can't have that. If we let them run wild, we'll have war again, this time with my own subjects living among them. I won't have the roads turned into killing grounds. Mance's mouth thinned. If we march the king's men up there in force, it will look like an invasion. That will only strengthen their distrust. My people and I will try one more time to talk sense into them. If they still won't see reason, we may have no choice but to treat them as outlaws. Ned interjected softly. Let me send some of my men with you, northern soldiers who understand the land and might be seen as less threatening than knights in plate. We can meet them halfway. If they refuse diplomacy, we do what must be done. Mance considered the offer. It's worth a try. Tormund Giantsbane is already there, urging caution. If we can avoid bloodshed, so much the better. Agreed. Robert looked around, his gaze lingering on a group of children who stared at him with wide eyes. We've come this far to keep the realm united. Let's not tear it apart over a few stubborn clans. It was a pragmatic statement, one that might not have seemed possible from the Robert Baratheon of a few years past. But time had changed the king. The responsibilities of the crown, the weariness of court intrigues, and the realization that war was often a poor solution had tempered him, if only somewhat. That evening, a feast of sorts took place in Castle Black's main hall. Fires crackled in every available hearth, and the long tables were set with bowls of hot stew, bread, and flagons of ale. Jeor Mormont presided at the head table, flanked by King Robert and Eddard Stark. Mance Rayder, as a kind of royal guest, sat near them as well, though his presence drew uneasy stares from some of the Black brothers who still viewed him as a deserter. The conversation was subdued but purposeful. They spoke of supply lines, the rumored threat of White Walkers, and the many small steps needed to maintain peace among such disparate groups. Every so often, Tormund's booming laughter echoed through the hall from farther down the table, where he regaled anyone who would listen with tales of his exploits among the giants. Next to Tormund sat Jon Snow, looking both amused and a bit embarrassed at the wildling's exaggerations. Samwell Tarly, on Jon's other side, sipped his ale timidly, trying not to choke whenever Tormund bellowed too loudly. King Robert took note of Jon. The lad was of an age with his own son Joffrey, though they could not have been more different. Jon was quiet, even brooding, with the polite manner of a young man who'd grown up in Ned Stark's household. Robert watched him, pondering old memories of Lyanna Stark, the girl he'd once loved with all his heart. He wondered if Ned saw her in Jon, though he did not voice such thoughts aloud. Ned was a reserved man, and Robert had come to accept that certain topics would remain unspoken between them. After the meal, men drifted into smaller groups, discussing plans or simply warming themselves by the fire. The king found himself speaking privately with Ned and Mance near a smoky fireplace in one corner of the hall. The smell of burning logs was strong, mingling with the scent of sweat and ale. Robert sighed, swirling the dregs of his cup. In King's Landing, they don't understand the scale of this. Some of the lords think I've gone mad, trying to tame the wildlings. They say the cost is too high and the reward too uncertain. Mance shrugged. We've never asked for taming, only acceptance. But I know how your southern politics work. Gold and status rule your noble hearts. Ned's gaze flicked between them. It's not just about gold. The southern lords fear what they don't know. Many can't grasp life beyond the wall. They see it as a wasteland. To them, if the wildlings bring no immediate profit and only trouble, why bother? Because winter does not care about profit, Mance said quietly. Nor do the others if they wake. But we can't blame them entirely. Fear blinds men. Robert rumbled agreement. Indeed it does. That's why I need you both. Ned, as Warden of the North, you're my anchor here. Mance, as the leader of the free folk, you must keep your people in line. I'll do what I can to support you from the throne. Together, we might stand a chance if the worst comes. He paused, frowning. But gods, I pray we never see these others." Ned's eyes were steady. "We prepare for the worst, even as we hope it never arrives. That's the northern way." Mance nodded, sipping from his cup. "Aye, and it's the free folks' way, too, in our own manner. We've always lived on the edge, ready to flee or fight when the cold demands it. But now, for the first time, we have a chance not just to run, but to stand together." Robert clapped him on the shoulder, nearly spilling his drink. "Then stand we shall." That night, the king bedded down in a warm chamber the Black brothers had hurriedly cleared for his arrival. The wind battered at the walls, howling like a hungry beast. Robert lay awake for a time, thinking of the grand expansions and the looming threats. A sense of weight settled on him, a burden that had replaced the simpler joys of his youth. Being king was a responsibility that never slept. Far from Castle Black, beyond the newly formed frontier settlements, the wild heart of the far north beat in quiet defiance of mortal concerns. The Frostfang Mountains loomed over desolate plains where icy winds carved the snow into strange shapes. The nights were endless here, darkness dominating all but a few hours of weak sunlight. In this twilight realm, a party of Night's Watch Rangers camped in silence, their cloaks pulled tight. Among them was Benjen Stark, on a mission to scout the deeper territories and confirm the chilling rumors of an ancient menace. They had come across abandoned wildling camps, half covered by drifting snow. Broken spears, scattered bones, and footprints that ended abruptly, as though the owners had vanished into thin air. The men spoke little at night, huddled around a small fire, ears straining for the slightest sound that might herald wights or worse. The winter wind carried strange moans and whistles through the dark valleys. Sometimes it sounded like distant screams. By the glow of the fire, Benjen examined a broken piece of bone, carved in a spiral pattern. "One of the free folk must have dropped it," he murmured to a fellow ranger. "It's almost new." "Then they were here not long ago," the ranger replied, his breath ghosting in the frigid air. "But where are they now?" Benjen said nothing. He stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. The emptiness of this place weighed heavily, pressing in from all sides. Somewhere, far behind them, men were building a new future, forging alliances and dreaming of a united North. But out here, the ancient wilderness remained untamed, harboring secrets older than any king or wildling chieftain. Dawn came fitfully. The Rangers resumed their journey, following a valley that snaked between towering cliffs. The wind whipped snow into their faces, and visibility shrank to only a few feet. In that swirling gray haze, Benjen thought he saw a figure, pale and silent, watching from a ridge. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the whisper of the wind. Back at Castle Black, Jon Snow trained in the courtyard with some of the king's soldiers who had come north. The clash of steel on steel echoed off the dark walls. Though these were friendly matches, there was an undercurrent of tension. Each fighter wanted to prove his worth, to show that neither a black cloak nor a crowned stag overshadowed one's own skill. Jon fought with the fluidity Ser Roderick Castle had taught him at Winterfell, tempered by hours of practice among the Black brothers. More recently, he'd incorporated certain wildling techniques gleaned from sparring with Tormund and other free folk. After Jon disarmed a stout soldier from the Crownlands with a deft maneuver, he stepped back, offering a hand to help the man up. Applause and laughter rippled among the onlookers. King Robert, watching from a balcony above, grunted in approval. "He's cute. Yook, that lad," the king commented to Barristan Selmy. "Could teach my boy a thing or two about real swordsmanship." Barristan offered a polite nod. "He has Stark blood, your grace, and the North in his veins. That combination can be formidable." Robert's eyes glinted with something akin to regret or pride, perhaps a mixture of both. "So it is," he said quietly. That evening, as the king conferred with Ned and Mance about a plan to settle the dispute near Hardhome, a messenger arrived from Eastwatch by the Sea, breathless and half-frozen. The man collapsed in the entryway, clutching at Ned's cloak, his lips quivering with cold. Eddard Stark knelt to help him, while King Robert loomed behind, frowning. A hush fell over the hall. "Speak," Ned urged softly, wrapping the man in an extra cloak. "Tormund," the messenger managed between chattering teeth. "He's asked for help. The clans near Hardhome. Some joined him, some refused. Then they were attacked. Not by your men, but by something else." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold swept the hall. Robert's fist tightened on the hilt of his sword. "Attacked by whom?" he demanded. The messenger's eyes were wide with lingering terror. "He says they were dead things or ghosts in the snow, white as bone, moving in the darkness. Some men. Their eyes went blue, their skin ice-cold. They killed everything they touched. Tormund managed to flee, sending me south. He begs for aid." No one spoke for a long moment. The howling wind outside seemed to mock the hush. Finally, Mance Rayder exhaled a shaky breath, as though bracing himself for an old nightmare made real. Ned Stark stood slowly, his face grim, while King Robert's features twisted with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "If these are the others," Ned said gravely, "then our worst fears have come to pass." Mance ran a hand over his face. "Hardhome is on the coast. We've been trying to resettle that old ruin for months. We had no idea." Robert interrupted, his voice hoarse. "How many men does Tormund have?" "Perhaps a few hundred," Mance replied. "Mostly free folk warriors, but also families seeking a place to weather the winter. If they're being hunted by whites or the others themselves." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning his courage. When he opened them again, they burned with purpose. "Then we ride north. By the gods, I promised these people our protection. I won't have them slaughtered by this evil. We'll muster what men we can. I'll lead them myself if I have to." Ned placed a calming hand on Robert's shoulder. "We'll muster a force, yes, but we can't act rashly. Winter is fierce, and Hardhome is no easy journey from here. We must plan quickly but carefully." Mance nodded, agreeing. "We'll need all the dragonglass we can find, and any Valyrian steel if available. The free folk who remain in the area might lend their bows, but they'll also need leadership." Robert brushed aside caution. "We have that leadership in you, Rayder, in me, and in Ned. Let's not waste time. Tormund's men are out there, possibly facing an army of the dead." He turned to Jeor Mormont, who had stood by in grim silence. "Lord Commander, can I count on the Night's Watch?" Jeor Mormont's jaw tightened. "We'll do our duty, Your Grace, but I must leave a strong garrison here at the wall to guard our new settlements. We can't strip Castle Blackbear." Robert relented, nodding. "Send who you can spare." Ned scanned the room, his mind racing. "I'll call upon the Northern Bannermen. Umber, Karstark, Mormont of Bear Island, maybe the Glovers. Their men know how to travel in this cold. We may not get a huge force, but enough to show we stand together." Mance lifted a cautious brow. "We'll gather the free folk who've pledged to the Pact, but many have families to protect. They might be reluctant to leave them vulnerable. Still, when they hear of whites, they'll know what's at stake." The messenger, still trembling, looked between them. "Tormund said that these creatures kill with a cold sharper than any blade. He saw men freeze at their touch, watched them open blue eyes in an instant. He said only fire stopped them." A silence heavier than iron settled in the hall. Maester Eamon, who had been listening with a sorrowful gaze, let out a long sigh. The legends spoke of such things in the long night. Fire, dragonsteel, and the children's magic were said to hold back the dark. We have only a fraction of that power now, but perhaps it will be enough. Robert set his jaw. "We'll make do with what we have. If this is truly the enemy we've feared, we must face it head-on." Thus began a frantic scramble to organize a host capable of traveling to Hardhome on short notice, in the dead of winter, while carrying the tools needed to fight foes from nightmares. Ravens flew from Castle Black to Winterfell and beyond, summoning the North. Mance Rayder spread the word among the free folk, calling upon all warriors able to bear arms. King Robert commanded his knights to prepare for the harshest campaign they had ever known, each man outfitted with extra furs, flint for torches, and dragonglass daggers. Scant though they were, Ned Stark wrote letters urging caution, but also calling men to uphold their oaths to the realm. Within days, a motley army gathered at Castle Black. Northmen in thick cloaks stood shoulder to shoulder with wildlings in furs and patched leather, while a scattering of Crownland's knights, bristling with steel, tried to adapt to the biting cold. The Night's Watch contributed a contingent of rangers led by Corran Halfhand, while Lord Commander Mormont remained behind to defend the wall. King Robert took personal command of the Southern Knights, Ned Stark led the Northern Bannermen, and Mance Rayder headed the Free Folk. Each leader had a place in the makeshift chain of command. Tensions were inevitable, but necessity bound them together. Arya Stark watched from the battlements of Castle Black, eyes shining with a mixture of longing and fear, as the expedition prepared to depart. She had slipped away from her mother's watchful eye in Winterfell, hiding in a supply wagon to reach Castle Black. Now that she was here, Ned had no choice but to keep her close, though he would not allow her to ride with the main force. The men marched in columns, some on horseback, some on foot, and some leading supply-laden mules or small sledges. Their breath steamed in the freezing air. Banners snapped in the wind. The crowned stag of Baratheon, the dire wolf of Stark, and improvised standards from various free folk clans, antlers, bones, and scrap cloth tied to spear points. Jon Snow fell in with the Night's Watch contingent, wearing black and carrying Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword gifted to him by Jeor Mormont. He exchanged a small nod with King Robert as they set off. Robert's warhorse pawed the ground impatiently, clad in a warm blanket beneath its tack. The king himself wore a thick cloak lined with bear fur, a large sword sheathed at his side, and a warhammer strapped to his saddle, his old weapon from the rebellion days. There was something raw and determined in his face, as though he were stepping into the greatest test of his life. Mance Rayder led a group of free folk archers, with Ygritte among them, red hair peeking out from beneath her hood. Tormund's fate weighed heavily on Mance's mind, and he was determined to save the man if possible. But he also knew that Hardhome, perched on the windswept coast, could be a death trap if the rumors of whites were true. Eddard Stark and a cluster of his bannermen rode together. The Great John had arrived, roaring his support, though short of men due to winter losses. Lady Meage Mormont of Bear Island had come with a small but fierce band of warriors, one of her daughters among them. Men carried axes, spears, and torches, eyes hard. In the swirling snow, their breath mingled as they marched toward the unknown. The journey was a trial in itself. The land north of the Wall, once a place of forbidding mystery, was now a partially charted frontier, yet it remained perilous. Blizzards struck with little warning, forcing the army to halt and huddle behind rocky outcroppings or shallow ravines. Scouts rode ahead, struggling to find passable routes. Horses slipped on ice-coated rocks, and several men lost fingers to frostbite despite all precautions. At night, fires were scarce, as fuel was difficult to come by. Men burned what they could: dried dung, sparse driftwood from frozen rivers, even bits of old scavenged timbers from wildling camps. King Robert rode among them, cursing colorfully at the cold but refusing to turn back. A new rumor spread through the ranks. At night, some men claimed to see shapes moving just beyond the firelight, flickering white apparitions that melted into the storm whenever approached. The tension was palpable. Even the bravest warriors felt a knot of dread forming in their guts. On the 10th day out, they reached a stretch of coastline where jagged cliffs descended to an ice-choked sea. Great shards of frozen waves stood like sculptures along the shore, cracked and glistening in the wan light. The sound of ice grinding against itself added an eerie music to the wind. Here they made camp. Mance Rayder conferred with the scouts, who reported that Hardhome lay a few miles farther north, built on a sheltered bay. The place had once been a wildling settlement centuries ago, abandoned after some calamity lost to time. It was no place for the faint of heart, especially in winter. When the ragged host finally approached Hardhome at dawn, a strange hush fell over them. The settlement sprawled along a sloping beach, backed by cliffs. Tormund's people had erected crude wooden walls for defense, and repaired some of the old huts and larger structures left from generations past. But black smoke stained the sky, and as the king's forces drew nearer, they saw that sections of the wall had been torn down. Bodies lay strewn along the snowdrifts. Men, women, even children. The wind carried the stench of death and something fouler still, a metallic tang that made the hairs on the back of the neck rise. Robert Baratheon dismounted, warhammer in hand. His breath hissed in outrage at the sight. Eddard Stark and Mance Rayder joined him. The great Jon grimaced, and the men behind him exchanged anxious looks. Jon Snow stood at the ready, every sense alive with dread. Farther down the line, wildling archers knocked arrows, scanning the settlement for signs of movement. "Gods," Ned muttered, kneeling beside a fallen figure. The corpse's eyes were open, frozen in a rictus of horror, but at least they were not the icy blue of a wight. These were living folk, cut down. "Tormund?" Mance called out in a voice that strained with urgency. No answer came but the moan of the wind. Robert motioned to his knights. "Form a perimeter. Ned, take some of your men and secure those huts. Mance, see if there are survivors. We can't stay here long if the dead prowl these parts." The search began, each step tense with the possibility of an ambush. Men kicked aside broken planks, scanned half-collapsed roofs, and peered into smashed crates that littered the settlement. They found more bodies, many bearing slashes and stab wounds, but also signs of something unnatural, frost-rimed skin that seemed blackened by cold in strange patterns. Some corpses looked as though they had died only hours ago, yet they were stiff as if in deep winter's embrace for days. Others had limbs bent at impossible angles, as though assaulted by tremendous force. At last, a cry went up from a group of free folk searching near the largest structure, a rough long-haul Tormund's people had used as a communal gathering space. "Someone's alive!" they shouted. Men converged on the spot to find Tormund Giantsbane himself, slumped against a wall inside the hall, an axe clutched in his hands. Blood stained his furs and beard. He was breathing, but only just. Mance Rayder knelt beside him, pressing a hand to Tormund's shoulder. "Old friend," he murmured, voice heavy with relief and concern. "You're alive. Where are the others?" Tormund's eyes fluttered open, the light in them dim. "Mance, the dead came," he rasped. "We fought them with fire, managed to hold them off for a while, but they circled round at night, found a gap in the walls. Half the camp was asleep." He swallowed, a grimace contorting his face. Did any make it out?" Mance's voice cracked. "We're not sure. We just arrived." Tormund coughed weakly. "A few might have fled on boats. The rest," he squeezed his eyes shut. "They took our fallen. You don't understand. They take the dead, raise them up again. We saw men we knew, friends, walking at them with blue eyes." Robert approached, grim-faced. "This ends now," he declared. "Can you stand, Giantsbane?" Tormund tried to stand and sank back down, cursing at the pain. "I'll live, but I've got no strength left to fight. I can guide you, though, tell you what we saw." Mance beckoned for a man to help Tormund to safety. Eddard Stark stepped into the dim hall, scanning the darkness. A sense of oppressive cold pressed at him, as though the air itself were tainted. Jon Snow and a few black brothers followed, torches raised. The floor was littered with debris, splintered wood, old rags, half-eaten provisions. Ned's gaze lingered on a corner where frost coated the stones in a pattern reminiscent of a swirling vortex, as if something terribly cold had emanated from that spot. Outside, the assembled host clustered, forming defensive lines along the ruined walls. Men exchanged anxious glances, wondering if an enemy might lurk in the shadows, waiting to pounce. Some knights prayed under their breath. Free folk muttered half-superstitious incantations, gripping their weapons tightly. King Robert called for watchers to be placed on every approach, torches and fires to be lit in a wide circle to ward off the darkness. As the day wore on, they discovered small pockets of survivors in cellars, half dead from hunger and terror. Some babbled incoherently about pale figures with eyes like ice, about friends who rose again after falling in battle. The king's men offered them blankets, meager rations, and a semblance of protection. Mance recognized many faces among the survivors. Some were elders, some children, all traumatized. Crows circled overhead, drawn by the carnage. The cawing carried a grim resonance, as though the land itself wept for the horror unleashed here. Men gathered wood to burn piles of the dead, unwilling to let them remain unburied and risk them rising anew. The stench of charred flesh soon filled the icy wind. Night fell swiftly, as it often did in the depths of winter. Fires and torches lit the perimeter, a flickering ring of light in the vast darkness by the frozen sea. Scouts reported eerie shapes moving on the ridges above the settlement, though no clear sighting was confirmed. Morale ebbed. Men's nerves were wound tight as bowstrings. In the main hall, King Robert, Eddard Stark, Mance Rayder, and a few key figures huddled over a crude map of the region. Tormund, propped up against a makeshift pallet, provided what information he could. "They came at us from the inland side first," Tormund said, his voice hoarse. "We fought, but then they flanked from the cliffs. Gods only know how they scaled them. We never stood a chance in an open fight. Fire kills them, steel does not. I saw arrows bouncing off their pale armor, if you can call it that. They move fast, silent. And the whites, you have to burn them. Otherwise, they keep coming." Robert's thick fingers tapped restlessly on the table. "We have some dragonglass, but not enough to equip every man. Fire we can manage, so let's use that. We'll keep large bonfires along our perimeter, and every man should carry torches or flaming arrows if possible." He cast a glance at Ned. "We'll fight them here or take the survivors south?" Ned's face was etched with concern. "It might be wiser to evacuate whoever we can. Hardhome is too open to attack from multiple directions. But if we withdraw without a fight, the White Walkers will push further south unchallenged." Mance crossed his arms over his chest. "We stand our ground. If we leave this place to the dead, we grant them a foothold at the shore. They'll only grow stronger with every new corpse they claim. I'd rather die fighting than let that happen." A murmur of grim agreement went around the circle. They knew the stakes. Surrendering Hardhome might mean sacrificing not only the living here, but also giving the enemy the opportunity to raise more whites, fueling a growing army of the dead. Robert exhaled, steadying himself. "We do both," he decided. "We'll organize ships for evacuating civilians, women, children, elders, the injured, anyone who can't fight. Meanwhile, we hold the perimeter, use fire and dragonglass as best we can, and pray the others don't come in overwhelming force." Mance nodded. "I will need every able warrior. I'll see to gathering the wildlings in a dedicated warband. They'll fight to protect their own kin, no question." Ned and Robert glanced at Tormund, who mustered a painful grin. "I'll do what I can, but I'm not much use in a stand-up fight right now. Let's hope these devils don't come all at once." Jon Snow stood near the edge of the group, listening intently. He felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. The old stories were no longer stories. They were real, and he was about to stand against them. He silently prayed that his father, his friends, and these new allies would survive the trial to come. They worked through the night, fortifying what remained of the settlement's walls, building defensive barricades, organizing watch rotations. Fires were stoked until flames leapt high, defiant beacons in the cold. Men tried to snatch moments of rest, bedrolls laid out on frozen ground or inside half-collapsed huts, but the fear of an imminent attack kept most awake. The wind hissed, carrying faint whispers that might have been the rustle of the undead, or simply the imagination of exhausted souls. As dawn's weak light crept over the horizon, a shout went up from the watchtower perched on a cliff. Jon Snow raced to the vantage point, joined by Mance, Ned, and Robert. Their eyes widened at the sight. In the distance, beyond the settlement's perimeter, figures moved through the snow, white shapes numerous enough to appear as a shifting mass. Their approach was slow, deliberate, like the tide coming in. But even at a distance, the watchers could sense the chilling presence. Here was the army of the dead, or at least a vanguard of it. Mance Rayder inhaled sharply, his breath catching. Gods be good. They've come in daylight. Robert steadied himself against the makeshift railing, knuckles turning white. Then we meet them in daylight. Ready the men. Below, the camp sprang to life in a cacophony of alarm. Horns blared, men scrambled for weapons and torches, and the ring of steel on steel filled the air as swords were drawn. The scent of fear mingled with the tang of burning wood. Wildlings and knights alike formed ranks behind the patched walls. Ned Stark barked orders, positioning archers and spearmen. King Robert donned a heavier cloak and unslung his hammer, the same one that had ended Rhaegar Targaryen's life at the Trident. Could a mortal weapon kill another? They would soon find out. Jon Snow made his way to the line near Mance Rayder, Longclaw strapped across his back. He checked the dragonglass dagger at his belt, its black surface reflecting the torchlight. Samwell Tarly, face pale but determined, stood beside him, fumbling with a box of glass arrowheads. "We can do this," Jon told him, gripping his friend's shoulder. "Remember what we learned." Sam nodded, though his eyes were wide. "Burn them or use dragonglass," he repeated, as if reminding himself of a lesson. A hush fell over the defenders as the swarm of wights came into clearer view. They were men and women once, now husks with dead flesh, many missing limbs or bearing grievous wounds that did not slow them. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly blue radiance. Weapons clutched in their hands were rusted, broken, or improvised. In their wake, shadows flickered, shapes that might be others themselves, tall and pale, gliding silently. The first wave broke against the defenders like a tide of nightmares. Arrows flamed out from archers on the walls, igniting some of the wights. The undead collapsed, writhing in the snow as the fire consumed them. Men at ground level thrust flaming spears through gaps in the barricades, turning wights to ash. The stench of burning flesh thickened, and shrieks of the dying dead filled the air. Yet more wights kept coming, relentless, climbing over the bodies of their fallen. King Robert roared above the din, rallying his knights. Eddard Stark fought at his side, sword flashing in the pale daylight. A wight rushed Ned with startling speed. Ned sidestepped, driving his blade through its torso, but it kept clawing at him until Robert slammed his hammer against its back. The creature finally crumpled. A second wight lunged, and Ned cleaved its skull. He remembered Tormund's warning, though, and called for fire. A nearby knight set the twitching corpse ablaze. Off to one flank, Mance Rayder and a group of wildlings used torches in place of swords, hacking and burning each undead assailant. Ygritte loosed arrows tipped with dragonglass arrowheads, each shot burying itself in a wight and bringing it down instantly. She had a quiver of only a handful of such arrows, and she rationed them carefully, saving them for the wights that threatened to break the line. Jon Snow found himself fighting alongside Tormund's surviving warriors. He slashed with Longclaw, the Valyrian steel slicing clean through undead limbs. A wight came at him from behind, and he spun just in time to sever its outstretched arms. Another lunged, and Jon drove his dragonglass dagger into its chest, feeling the unnatural cold emanating from the creature's body. The wight stiffened, then collapsed, a whimpering hiss escaping its blackened lips. Even as the defenders gained ground, more wights poured in from every side. The half-standing walls began to splinter under the press of bodies. Screams erupted where men were pulled down, torn apart by claws and teeth. Arrows soared overhead, many flickering with flame. Some found their marks, igniting clusters of undead. Others missed and fell harmlessly into the snow. Smoke billowed in thick clouds, mingling with the swirling snowflakes. In the midst of the chaos, a different presence emerged. An other, tall and gaunt, its features sharp and inhuman. Dressed in armor like milky ice, it carried a blade of crystalline frost. The creature stepped through the carnage with eerie grace, as if untouched by the surrounding battle. Men shrank back instinctively, and a wave of crippling fear rippled outward. The temperature seemed to plummet further, frost forming on weapons and eyelashes. King Robert saw it first from across the smoky field. "Ned!" he roared. "There! It's one of them!" He charged forward, hammer raised, but the deep snow and the tangle of corpses hampered his advance. The other turned toward Robert, head tilting as though curious about this mortal who dared to approach. Eddard Stark, closer, rushed to intercept. He swung his sword, expecting a clash of steel, but the other moved faster than any man. In a blur, it parried Ned's strike with its frosty blade. Ned felt a jarring shock rattle up his arms. Ice crystals spread across his steel sword, cracking it. The blade shattered in a spray of frozen shards. Ned stumbled backward, stunned. Robert closed the distance, warhammer swinging in a powerful arc. The other merely sidestepped, so quickly that Robert's blow struck only empty air. It responded with a thrust of its ice blade, aiming for Robert's chest. At the last moment, the king twisted, taking the blow on his thickly furred shoulder. The blade sliced through fur and leather like parchment, grazing flesh beneath. Robert roared in pain, dropping to one knee as blood spattered the snow. Before the other could finish him, Mance Rayder appeared from the side, brandishing a torch and a long knife of dragonglass. He slashed at the creature's flank. The other released a sound like cracking ice, stepping back to avoid the torch's flame. Its cold eyes settled on Mance, as though assessing a new threat. Jon Snow, separated from the king by the press of wights, saw the danger. He hacked through two more undead, forging a path toward Robert and Ned. The great Jon joined in, bellowing as he flung burning pitch at a cluster of wights that threatened to overrun their position. Bit by bit, they edged closer. Mance circled the other, torch brandished, as Ned tried to shake off the shock of his shattered blade. Robert groaned, clutching his wounded shoulder. The other flicked its blade, scattering tiny crystals of ice. Each one glistened in the weak daylight, as if reflecting the entire wintry realm. Then, in one fluid motion, the creature lunged at Mance. He brought the torch up in time to deflect the blow, but the frigid blade sliced through the torch's wood, extinguishing the flame with a sharp hiss. Mance slashed with his dragonglass knife, catching the other's torso. There was a sudden spasm in the creature, as if the blade had indeed harmed it. A crackling sound emanated from the wound, spiderweb fractures spreading across the icy armor. In retaliation, the other backhanded Mance with inhuman strength, sending him crashing into the snow a dozen feet away. The knife flew from his hand, landing near Ned, who snatched it up. Ned lunged forward, but the other met him with a lightning-fast riposte. Only a desperate dive saved Ned from a fatal blow, and he rolled in the snow, his breath ragged. Just then, King Robert forced himself upright, teeth clenched against the pain. With his good arm, he hefted his warhammer, glaring at the other. A moment's distraction from the creature, which was focusing on Ned, gave Robert an opening. With a guttural roar, he swung the hammer, embedding its spiked head into the other's back where the armor had fractured. The collision rang out like glass shattering. The other stiffened, an otherworldly shriek ripping from its throat, a sound that froze the blood of all who heard it. Cracks spread across its form. Ned, seizing the moment, hurled Mance's dragonglass knife at the creature's chest. The blade hit home with a sharp crack, and the other exploded into shards of crystalline ice that dissolved into the wind, leaving nothing but an echoing whisper. A stunned silence fell around them, as if even the wights paused for a heartbeat. Then a tremor seemed to pass through the undead ranks, and many stumbled or collapsed, severed from the power animating them. Some retreated, shambling back into the swirling snow as if called away by an unseen master. Others continued to flail until defenders set them ablaze. The tide of battle began to shift. A battered cry of triumph rose from the living. Robert sagged to his knees, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his warhammer slipping from his grip into the snow. Ned hurried to his side, pressing a hand against the wound. "Hold on, Robert," he said breathlessly. Mance Rayder, bruised and likely with broken ribs, limped over. "We have to finish them," he wheezed, gesturing at the remaining pockets of wights. Ned nodded. "We will. But first we get the king to safety." He signaled frantically for a medic or maester. Within moments, a pair of men came rushing forward with bandages and a rudimentary stretcher. They hoisted the king onto it, his face pale as he fought the pain. The Great John roared orders to men around him, and the defenders pressed the advantage, setting more whites ablaze. Jon Snow fought with renewed vigor, remembering how the other had shattered under dragonglass and a mighty blow. When the last of the undead either lay smoldering or had vanished into the white distance, an uneasy quiet settled over Hardhome. Bodies littered the snow, many of them beyond recognition, and the fires burned on, sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. In the aftermath, survivors gathered around the main hall, exhausted but alive. Tormund was found still alive but unconscious, and they brought him inside to be tended by Maester Aemon's apprentice, who had accompanied them. King Robert lay on a pallet, his shoulder wound, carefully bandaged and salved with the limited medicines they had. He stared at the ceiling, jaw clenched. Eddard Stark and Mance Rayder, each battered in their own right, stood nearby. "We drove them off," Ned told Robert. "At least for now." Robert's voice was hoarse. "We killed one of those devils. Saw it shatter. Never thought I'd witness such a thing. But there are more out there, aren't there?" Mance inclined his head, the seriousness etched in every line of his face. "Likely so. This was just the first. We can't assume they'll withdraw forever." A troubled hush followed. The living had won a costly victory, but the threat of the others remained, lurking in the darkness beyond Hardhome. The taste of ashes and the stench of burned whites clung to the air, a reminder of the horrors they had faced. In that moment, it was clear to all that the alliances forged between the king's men, the free folk, and the North were no mere political arrangement. They were a bulwark against a terror that threatened every beating heart in the realm. Night arrived again, long and cold. Fires dotted the settlement like scattered stars, each pit fiercely guarded against the shadows. Men took shifts, standing watch, weapons at the ready. Some sat quietly, haunted by the memory of seeing the others in the flesh. Others tried to snatch a few hours of sleep, though nightmares of icy blades and glowing blue eyes plagued them. Jon Snow rested by one of the central fires, gaze distant. He had never felt so frightened, nor so alive. He glanced at Samwell Tarly, who was tending to a wound on the arm of a wildling warrior. Sam's hands shook, but he persevered. Nearby, Ygritte sharpened a spear, occasionally throwing sidelong looks at Jon. Exhaustion weighed on everyone, but they had survived. Together, word spread of the king's courage. Men marveled that Robert Baratheon had faced an other in single combat and lived. Even the wildlings, who had initially viewed him with suspicion, admitted respect for his bravery. Meanwhile, whispers also circulated about how Eddard Stark had rescued the king and delivered the final blow with dragonglass. It was an omen, some said, that the Starks were meant to stand at the forefront of this war with the night. In a quieter corner of the camp, Mance Rayder stood with Tormund, who had regained consciousness. The big man's voice was raspy, but his spirit unbroken. "We lost good folk here," Tormund said, staring at the flickering fire. "Friends, family. But we're not dead yet. We fought back, gave as good as we got. Maybe that's enough to keep hope alive." Mance laid a hand on Tormund's shoulder. "We'll mourn them, then we'll rebuild. We have a new realm to protect, and we'll protect it with every ounce of strength left." Outside, the winter wind keened, carrying the echoes of ancient powers. Far away, hidden in the swirling snow of uncharted wastes, more others roamed, gathering whites to their silent ranks. But for one day, one precious day, humanity had held the line. King Robert Baratheon's grand gamble in forging a pact beyond the wall had borne its first fruit. A united force that refused to yield to the cold specters of legend. Whether that unity could endure the full fury of the long night remained uncertain. Yet in the battered remains of Hardhome, among smoking corpses and piles of shattered ice, the realm had discovered both its vulnerability and its potential. The living had pushed back against the shadows with fire and dragonglass, with alliances once thought impossible. In the eyes of Eddard Stark, Mance Rayder, and King Robert, a silent vow was etched. They would stand together or perish separately. Dawn broke at last, pallid and wan. As the pale sun climbed above the jagged cliffs, it revealed the night's devastation with merciless clarity. Smoke rose from funeral pyres where men burned their dead to prevent them from rising again. Survivors, wrapped in blankets, stared numbly at the carnage. Yet for all the sorrow in the air, there was also a fierce determination. Plans took shape to fortify Hardhome and bring in more supplies, to gather more dragonglass, to send messages south urging the forging of alliances with every kingdom and every house that would listen. King Robert, his wound cleaned and stitched, managed to stand with Ned's assistance. He looked out over the encampment, seeing wildlings, men of the Night's Watch, northern bannermen, and even the battered knights who had marched under his banner. All of them had bled and suffered together. Slowly, painfully, he raised his good arm, beckoning those within earshot. "Hear me," he called, voice rough. "We came to Hardhome as people of different lands, different loyalties. But we fought the dead together and we lived. Remember that. When the others come again, and they will, this is how we stand a chance." Side by side, a weary cheer rose, tinged with the knowledge of how easily it could have gone another way. The king's words carried across the broken walls, echoing among the ruins, and men of all stripes felt a small surge of hope. If once mortal enemies could unite against the darkness, perhaps the realm might endure the winter and whatever terrors it brought. In that fleeting moment, Hardhome stood as a testament to what unity could achieve. Though scars ran deep and caution would forever be needed, the dawn had come. The living, at least for now, had prevailed, and the new shape of the realm, extending beyond the wall, bridging old divides, stood as both shield and sword against the gathering night. The North had always been harsh, but never before had so many worked so hard to keep its cold heart beating. Perhaps that was the best measure of King Robert's grand experiment. Even in the darkest hours, humanity still found light enough to kindle a torch, and sometimes that was all it took to hold back the endless dark.